Welcome to a story so harrowing, so deeply buried beneath the layers of silence and denial, that, even today, few dare to speak of it aloud. What you're about to hear is not a fable, not a conspiracy theory, not the plot of a horror movie, but a chilling reality that unfolded in a country many believe to be a beacon of freedom and justice. This is the truth that was covered with ashes, erased with fire, sealed in silence, and whispered only among those brave enough to remember. This is the story of 278 women, not prisoners, not enemies of the state, not fugitives from the law. These were women just like your neighbor, your sister, your coworker, women who lived and breathed and loved, until one day, they disappeared. And they didn't just vanish from their homes. They were taken into the forests, deserts, and mountains of America to secret religious Reformation camps. Places with no names, no maps, no accountability. Places where salvation was promised, but silence was enforced. Where obedience was not earned, but beaten into the soul. The timeline is recent. Too recent. From the late 1970s through the early 1990s, these camps operated under a doctrine that called itself holy, a doctrine designed not to guide, but to erase. They called it the doctrine of silent correction. A movement cloaked in scripture, baptized in fear, and weaponized against women who were labeled difficult, defiant, or simply different. And behind its righteous facade, it hid decades of psychological control, physical abuse, and what some survivors now call systematic spiritual torture. This wasn't some isolated cult. It was a network. Dozens of camps scattered across Idaho, Montana, Arkansas, and even parts of rural Canada. Funded through shadowy organizations. Staffed by unlicensed so-called clergy. Protected by loopholes in religious freedom laws and the willful blindness of those in power. Girls as young as 14 were sent away by their families. Women in their 40s were abducted by husbands, church elders, or even strangers. Once inside, names were stripped away. They were given numbers instead. Their heads were shaved. Their identities erased. Journals confiscated. Words forbidden. Crying punished, and if they resisted, they disappeared, some say into isolation cells. Others say into the woods beyond the compound fences. The lucky ones reappeared, changed forever. The others were never seen again. All records destroyed. Buildings later burned to the ground. And yet, fragments remained. Journals. Clothing. Teeth. Bone. These women didn't vanish by chance. They were taken. They were silenced. They were erased, and the world barely blinked. There were no national headlines. No official investigations. No justice. Only the faint traces of their existence. A forgotten ledger here, a whispered story there, and a growing silence that has become too loud to ignore. Today, we break that silence. Today, we remember their names, or at least, the idea of them. Because justice cannot begin until truth is spoken. And though the doctrine has changed forms, disappeared into the folds of new churches, private compounds, and whispered theology, the danger is far from over. This is not just a story about what happened. It is a warning about what can happen again, and it all begins here, with the forgotten women and the doctrine that tried to make them ghosts. This is the untold story of 278 disappeared women, and the silent war waged in the name of faith. Darkness settles over a rugged mountain range at dusk. The last rays of sun vanish behind jagged peaks, plunging a hidden valley into cold twilight. An abandoned highway winds into the depths of this wilderness, disappearing into dense pine forests. No signs warn travelers. No cell signal reaches here. Only one thing waits beyond the trees, a secret so brutal it defies belief. In the early 1970s, a man named Gideon Hale wandered into this valley with an idea that would change lives forever. He called it the doctrine of silent correction. He promised salvation. He delivered something far more terrifying. This is the story of how his doctrine began, how it grew, and how it swallowed hundreds of women without a trace. A dusty town on the edge of nowhere. Gideon Hale arrives in an old pickup truck. He wears a simple suit, a soft smile, and eyes that burn with conviction. He carries a battered suitcase filled with pamphlets he wrote himself. Inside are thin sheets of paper printed with a doctrine that preaches total obedience, absolute silence, and the cleansing power of isolation. Gideon visits local churches, introducing himself as a traveling minister. He preaches that modern society corrupts women's souls. He argues that wives must surrender their voices to husbands. Daughters must surrender their minds to fathers. Women who question authority have fractured spirits and risk damning their families to eternal suffering. He hosts small gatherings in church basements and community halls. At first, only a handful of curious women come to listen. They leave unsettled but intrigued by Gideon's calm assurance that a deeper truth lies hidden beneath everyday life. He offers them a chance to find purity through a process he calls spiritual recalibration. Word spreads. Gideon recruits local leaders he calls shepherds. These men pledge fealty to the doctrine and help build Reformation camps deep in the woods. No maps, no public records. Men in dark clothing haul lumber and build crude barracks under cover of night. They erect barbed wire fences, dig trenches for watchtowers, and install heavy gates with locks that click like the jaws of a trap. Gideon's followers print new pamphlets and distribute them in rural mailboxes. They target families troubled by marital strife or generational conflict. Husbands desperate to fix rebellious wives. Fathers worried about disobedient daughters. All are given a contract granting custody of the woman to the doctrine's leaders for up to 18 months. The fine print, printed in nearly invisible ink, stipulates absolute silence and no contact with the outside world until approved. An anxious mother tears at her hair as she fills out the contract to help her daughter find spiritual peace. She watches the shepherds arrive late one night in unmarked vans. They remove her daughter from her bed in the darkness. The next morning, the porch where she sat is empty. No note. No goodbye. Just silence. Inside the camp, the young woman is given a number instead of a name. She learns that questioning the doctrine is the gravest sin. Every sunrise brings forced meditations in freezing streams. Every sunset brings confessions shouted into stone troughs until voices crack. Punishments escalate quickly. A single whispered word in defiance earns days in solitary confinement, curled in a wooden cage so small she cannot stand. Gideon's voice echoes across the compound each dawn. He stands on a raised platform wearing a simple robe. His followers kneel before him, their heads bowed like broken trees. He proclaims that speech betrays spirit, that memory is poison, that only through complete surrender can women be redeemed. He invites them to exchange any lingering scraps of will for the promise of grace. Some women break immediately, weeping, begging for mercy. Others shut down completely, their eyes empty, faces pale as death. A handful resist. They confront Gideon, demanding to know why they are imprisoned. He smiles and issues his verdict. Their voices must be erased. They will be sent to a remote outpost in the deepest ravine where only silence rules. Night falls. A group of resisting women is marched through the forest, illuminated by flickering lanterns. The sound of branches snapping beneath heavy boots and the chanting of hymns creates a nightmare symphony. They reach a yawning chasm, walls of rock dripping with moss. Giles, the head shepherd, prods them forward. One by one, they step over the edge into the darkness below. Their screams vanish instantly. Gideon speaks over the ravine, his voice calm as a breeze through the pines. He tells his followers that the chasm is sacred ground, where disobedience is consumed by the earth itself. He instructs everyone else to chant the doctrine's creed until dawn. The moon watches silently as the forest absorbs every sound. Back at the main camp, Gideon finalizes plans to expand. He commissions more shepherds. He orders the creation of smaller compounds across 3 states. He guarantees families that their loved ones will be restored to normal life once purified. He profits from donations and insists that any suspicion from outsiders is evidence of spiritual interference. He convinces authorities that these retreat centers are private religious resorts. Local sheriffs, some devout followers themselves, refuse to investigate missing persons complaints. Court records vanish, witness testimonies disappear under mysterious circumstances. The doctrine of silent correction thrives in the shadows. Late one night, Gideon sits alone in his quarters, the flickering glow of a single candle illuminating his face. He writes in his journal, "Today we saved another soul. Today we silenced another voice. The world will remember love, but lost whispers teach the truest lessons." He smiles and closes the book. Footsteps echo outside his door. A new recruit, trembling, delivers a sealed crate marked with a number. Gideon places it on the table without curiosity. Another name to vanish. This is how the doctrine began. A simple promise of salvation twisted into a machine of erasure. A community's blind faith turned into a conspiracy of silence. Hundreds of women were swallowed by unseen camps. Their stories buried beneath pine needles and broken prayers. As dawn breaks on the valley, the barbed wire fences rust in the light. The camps still stand in ruin. But the doctrine, like a virus, still festers in secret enclaves. The world thinks this chapter closed. But over 200 voices were stolen before their time. Their echoes remain buried in the dark. If you believe this story must be told, share it far and wide. Speak their names. Keep their memory alive. Because silence is only as powerful as the secrets it hides. And in the shadows of history, the doctrine of silent correction still whispers. A soft wind whispers through the pine trees. Cold morning fog clings to the forest floor like a memory refusing to let go. Somewhere, deep in the remote corners of North America, an old iron gate creaks open to a place long forgotten by the world. Behind that gate, the truth is buried beneath layers of silence, obedience, and darkness. This is not the story of a lost village, or a war, or an accident. This is the story of how 278 women disappeared behind the walls of religious correction camps, never to return. This is the chilling tale of the doctrine that erased them, and the unimaginable life inside those camps that was designed to break every last fragment of who they were. The arrival, where their names ended when the women arrived. They were not greeted. They were processed. Most were dragged from their homes in the middle of the night. Some were deceived with promises of a retreat or healing journey. Others were handed over willingly by family members convinced they were sending their daughters, wives, or sisters to a place of spiritual cleansing. The truth was far darker. The camp stood hidden behind tall wooden fences, miles from any road. Armed men wearing black uniforms with no badges stood guard. These men were called shepherds. They answered only to the doctrine. Women stepped off buses with nothing but the clothes they wore. Their bags were taken, their jewelry stripped, their names removed. From that moment forward, they were addressed only by numbers. You are not Rachel. You are not Linda. You are not Sarah. You are now daughter, 18. Or vessel, 43. Or silence, 61. The rules. Speak, NUSUFFER. The doctrine of silent correction was clear. Speech is rebellion. Individuality is sin. Memory is the enemy. The women were forbidden from speaking to each other. Even whispering was punishable. They were required to memorize phrases from the doctrine's text. The voice is the mouth of the devil. To silence the voice is to purify the soul. Any woman caught crying, asking questions, or resisting orders was isolated in what they called reflection boxes, wooden crates barely large enough to sit in, kept in pitch-black underground chambers. Some women spent days inside, others weeks. Many came out broken. Some never came out at all. The daily regime. Obedience through torture every day began at 4:00 a.m. not with bells, but with screams. Loudspeakers played pre-recorded chants of obedience, while floodlights lit the entire compound. The women were marched barefoot into the freezing woods. They were forced to kneel in cold water streams, arms raised, chanting verses until their limbs trembled and their lips turned blue. Breakfast was a thin broth and a slice of moldy bread. But not before another hour of confession circles, where they were required to confess sins they hadn't committed or face punishment for holding back. The doctrine claimed that false confessions were still useful. They helped cleanse the soul by breaking the will. From sunrise to sunset, the women were forced into labor, hauling logs, digging trenches, sewing uniforms for incoming prisoners, and reciting doctrine verses from memory over and over and over. At night, they slept on wooden pallets. with no blankets, often shackled at the ankles. A woman who spoke in her sleep was dragged from her bunk and silenced. Sometimes her bunkmates never saw her again. The punishments were not just cruel. They were calculated. Some women were forced to wear hoods for weeks at a time so they would forget the faces of others. Others were made to stand in front of mirrors for hours while chants of "the self is a sin" echoed through loudspeakers. A few were locked in pits with recordings of Gideon Hale, the founder of the doctrine, preaching about the unworthiness of women. These pits were called voiceless wells. They were filled with insects, rats, and sometimes worse. Rumors spread not through speech, but through glances and silent gestures about a place in the woods. A clearing surrounded by crosses. A circle of rocks. They called it the Ravine of Purity. Women taken there never came back. The mind games. Erase the self. Become nothing. The most terrifying part of the camps wasn't the beatings. It wasn't the starvation or the darkness. It was how effective the doctrine was at erasing identity. After just a few weeks, many women stopped trying to speak. After a few months, they stopped remembering their own names. They spoke the doctrine's language. They obeyed without question. Some even reported their fellow captives, not out of malice, but because they had come to believe silence was salvation. One woman was forced to burn a childhood photograph, while other women stood around her and chanted, "Memory is a lie." She later said in a secret journal, "I don't remember who she was. I burned her. Now I am daughter 96. And daughter 96 is obedient." The escape attempts, few, and fatal escape was nearly impossible. Some tried. A young woman known only as Vessel, 73, made it to the perimeter fence. She was caught, dragged into the central square, and forced to kneel while the shepherds recited a cleansing ceremony. She was never seen again. Her bunkmates found her bracelet the next morning outside the fence, snapped in half. Another woman faked obedience for weeks. On the day of a scheduled supply delivery, she broke into the driver's truck and fled down the dirt road. Her body was found days later in the forest, barefoot, her throat slashed, and the word "silenced" carved into her forearm. The camps had no mercy, only doctrine. 278 missing, no graves. No records. By the time the doctrine camps were exposed in the early 1990s, they had already moved or vanished. Buildings were burned, files destroyed. Shepherds disappeared into the wind. Of the hundreds of women believed to have entered the camps, only a few were confirmed to have returned home. Most of them were never the same. Some could not remember their family members. Others refused to speak. A few took their own lives within months, but 278 women vanished. No graves. No bodies. No police investigations that led to answers. Their names remain unlisted. Their stories silenced. The doctrine succeeded. The camps may be gone. The fences torn down. The fields now overgrown, but the doctrine never truly ended. It lives in the unspoken stories. In the traumatized silence of the survivors. In isolated communities where obedience is demanded and silence is enforced. And maybe, just maybe, in secret places still hidden, deep in the woods, where no one dares to look, because silence is the perfect weapon, and when no one listens, no one remembers. This was the life inside the camps. This was the reality behind the doctrine that erased them, and unless we speak it, unless we scream it into the daylight, it will return. A fog rolls across the treetops like a breath being held. The sky is pale and lifeless. Somewhere in the shadows of forgotten pine-covered hills, a silence has taken root so deep, so absolute, it has consumed every trace of what once lived there. No birds sing. No footsteps echo. No laughter returns. Only the trees remember, and deep beneath those trees, something terrible happened. This is the true, terrifying story of 278 women who vanished from religious Reformation camps. Not into another town. Not into a new life. They vanished into a doctrine, into silence, into erasure. This is the vanishing, and how a twisted belief system turned women into ghosts that history refused to see. The final step into nothing. The buses came at night. No headlights. No license plates. No sound but the grind of tires against gravel. Women were loaded one by one, bound by wrist ties or drugged into silence. Their names were recorded in a private ledger, handwritten, hidden, never shared. For the outside world, these women were away on retreats, in therapy, or off the grid by choice. But they weren't. They were prisoners of a belief. The camps they entered were remote compounds, isolated by distance and philosophy. They were not built to reform. They were built to remove. Upon arrival, each woman was stripped of her belongings. Clothes replaced with gray robes. Hair cut to the scalp. Names taken. Voices forbidden. Identity erased. They became numbers. Roles. Vessels. Objects to be reshaped, and then, the world simply lost them. The slow dissollution life inside the camps was not just cruel. It was intentional destruction. Every moment, every task, every punishment was designed to erode the woman from within. They were told not to think. They were told not to remember. They were told that their past lives, their loves, their families, their passions were temptations of the flesh and needed to be discarded. A woman who asked for her mother's name was taken to isolation. A woman who cried for her child was starved for 3 days. A woman who whispered her own name under her breath was beaten with a rod carved with scripture. Every month, at least one woman would disappear. Quietly. Without warning. The bed left cold the next morning. Her number no longer called during roll. No burial. No explanation. The others were told simply this: she has been purified. The purification chamber. Some survivors spoke of a place they called the purification chamber. It was not listed in any doctrine document. No schedule. No records. But they all knew of it. It was located deep beneath the central structure, behind a locked metal door. The walls were white. The lights never turned off, and the women who entered it were brought there by force, blindfolded and gagged. Inside, strange experiments were conducted in the name of spiritual silence. Electric pulses to the scalp. Forced fasting beyond 30 days. Waterboarding with holy water. Repetitive chant hypnosis that ran for hours. Some came back unable to speak. Others were wheeled out unconscious, but most were never seen again. The records that never existed. Families were told their daughters had run away, that they had refused healing, that they had chosen exile, but phone calls were blocked. Letters returned. And the camps, registered under different religious nonprofits, operated under such secrecy that law enforcement turned a blind eye. A woman named Nora tried to report her sister missing after sending her to the Doctrine's healing grounds in Utah. She was told her sister had joined a remote commune in the mountains and chosen a life of silence. But her sister's last letter said one thing: they don't let us speak. Help me. Help me before I forget who I am. That was the final message. The ravine of the Viennishhed, one former shepherd, under a false name, later described a hidden valley behind the northernmost camp. It was only accessible by rope, steep, isolated, dead quiet. This valley, he claimed, was known internally as the ravine of the vanished. A place where women who resisted too long, fought too hard, were taken in the dead of night. Their robes were removed. Their identities dissolved. They were led into the earth and told they would emerge as true vessels of silence. But none ever returned. This shepherd claimed there were mass graves there, unmarked, uncounted, covered in stones and moss. No names. No prayers, just numbers, and yet no search ever reached it. No forensic investigation was allowed. The final dissent of the few who survived and escaped, most were shattered shells of who they once were. One woman, formerly known as Vessel, 72, wandered into a gas station in Oregon 6 months after disappearing. She was barefoot, speaking in tongues, and unable to recall her own face. Her back was covered in scars shaped like branches, carved in ritualistic patterns. Another survivor, Silence, 88, gave one haunting interview before vanishing again. We thought death was the end. But the doctrine taught us that the worst death is forgetting you ever lived. 278 never came back. 278 women were taken into the camps. 278 women were never seen again. No bodies. No graves. No court cases. Just empty records. Vanished tax files. Ghosted family trees, mothers who never stopped looking, daughters who never returned home. The doctrine blamed the women themselves. They were too corrupt to be saved, too broken, too unwilling. So they were removed, spiritually, physically, completely. The world moved on. The news cycle changed. The files were sealed, but 278 names remain unwritten. The vanishing never ended to this day. Whispers of the doctrine remain. In isolated churches, in off-grid communities, in survivalist religious groups operating in plain sight. Their teachings remain hidden beneath smiles and robes. Their leaders still quote Gideon Hale's writings. They still believe in purification. They still believe in silence. They still believe that women are vessels, not voices. The vanishing did not end. It just evolved. It hides beneath new names, new buildings, new websites, and unless we speak up, unless we remember those who were taken, the vanishing will continue. The price of silence. This was not an old world tragedy. This was not ancient history. This happened in modern times, in our lifetimes, in our backyards. 278 women were erased. Not by war, not by illness, but by belief. By doctrine. By silence, and silence, when left unchallenged, always returns. The truth has enemies. Sometimes those enemies wear masks of power. Sometimes they wear crosses, and sometimes they wear silence like armor. What you are about to hear is not just a story about 278 women who vanished from religious correction camps hidden across the American wilderness. This is the story of what happened after. Or rather, what didn't happen. Because while their screams faded into forests, while their names were turned into numbers, while their graves were left unmarked, the world kept spinning, and no one came to save them. This is the investigation that never was. Not because no one knew, but because too many did. Whispers in the dark. When the first women began disappearing in the 1970s and 80s, no one raised alarms. Their families were told they had entered silent service or chosen a path of spiritual withdrawal. Local police, when contacted, treated the disappearances as voluntary, runaways, troubled girls, misguided souls, and the religious organizations running the camps held legal documents signed by family members, documents granting spiritual custody to the church. The doctrine of silent correction knew how to stay hidden. The camps were registered as private religious retreats. They didn't need state oversight. They didn't allow cameras. They didn't allow visitors. They didn't allow questions. Even when some women escaped, their testimonies were brushed aside as exaggerated trauma or delusions. No one wanted to believe what they said, because to believe them would mean admitting something horrifying, that America had built its own system of spiritual extermination, and the government had looked the other way. Barriers in the late 1980s, a woman named Meryl Dawson contacted the county sheriff's office after her niece, Alyssa, vanished from a doctrine camp in northern Idaho. She brought letters. She brought a photograph of Alyssa with bruises. She brought 2 survivors who said Alyssa had been taken to the bottom cell, a place underground where voices never returned. But the sheriff never filed the report. The doctrine had supporters in high places, local police, county judges, even city council members. Some were part of the faith, others were paid, some believed in the mission, others just stayed quiet. When Meryl pushed harder, she was warned by an anonymous call that her house might not withstand fire. 2 months later, it burned to the ground. No arrests. No investigation. No mention in the paper. The federal blindness years passed. More women vanished. By 1990, the numbers should have triggered alarms, but the doctrine had mastered one trick better than any cult before it: fragmentation. Each camp was registered under a different shell name: Healing Hills Ministries, Silent Creek Center, The Path of Grace. No centralized database. No umbrella organization. No federal pattern. Every time a federal agency was approached, the FBI, the Department of Justice, even state-level investigators, they found nothing illegal. The women had been signed away. The doctrine wasn't kidnapping. It was reformation. protected under religious freedom, even when a retired agent named Philip Crosser attempted to compile data across state lines. He was stonewalled. His files were seized after an anonymous tip accused him of illegally surveilling religious institutions. 3 months later, Crosser was found dead in his cabin. Gunshot wound. No weapon recovered. Ruled a suicide. Case closed. The missing files. In 1993, an investigative journalist named Caleb Rowan began publishing a series of articles titled The Doctrine That Erased Them. He uncovered birth certificates, school records, dental charts, all belonging to women who had vanished. He interviewed families who signed custody forms under pressure. He found a whistleblower named Elias, a former shepherd, who gave him internal logs and location data. Rowan's final article was supposed to expose the location of a mass burial site in a forest just outside Bozeman, Montana. He submitted the piece. It never printed. The next morning, his body was found near a ravine. Blunt force trauma to the head. Local police ruled it an accident. His car, his notes, his audio recordings, all gone. His article, deleted from the system. The newspaper shut down within 6 months due to unexpected legal pressures. The sealed case. As by the mid-2000s, families had filed over 100 missing persons reports connected to the camps, but nearly all of them were quietly dismissed. Some were marked as resolved, others disappeared from state databases. When a woman named Julia Marston requested a copy of her sister's missing case file in 2006, she received an envelope with only one sheet inside. A typed sentence, "Case withdrawn due to lack of evidence." But Julia had evidence. Her sister's last letter had a map, a drawing of a chain-link fence, 3 watchtowers, and the words, "They say we are being saved. But all I hear is dirt being shoveled." No one would take her statement. No lawyer would represent her. She vanished 6 months later, her car found on an abandoned road, the windows shattered. No blood. No body, just a page from a doctrine prayer book on the dashboard, stained in red. The price of expose. Every time someone got too close, they disappeared. Not always physically, sometimes professionally. A young federal intern named Maria Lopez tried to reopen 5 old missing persons cases in 2010. She was fired without cause. Her emails deleted. Her access revoked. She later said in a podcast that a man in a gray suit came to her apartment one night. He said only one thing: the doctrine protects its own. After that, she left the country. She hasn't been heard from in over a decade. The investigation that never was. There were no arrests. No trials. No forensic digs. No national headlines. The doctrine survived because it didn't need to. It was protected. By laws. By silence. By people too afraid to admit the truth. 278 women vanished, not by mistake, not by chaos, but by design. And every system built to protect them looked away, because the real terror is not what the doctrine did. It's what the world allowed it to do. In the dense wilderness of northern Idaho, far from any marked trail or town, 3 hikers wandered into a deep ravine in the summer of 2015. It was remote, untouched, and strangely silent. That silence shattered when they stumbled upon something grotesquely out of place: a cluster of sealed wooden crates, aged and water-damaged but intact. They were stacked in a haphazard way, half buried under decades of moss and rot. Curiosity turned to horror the moment the crates were opened. Inside were women's clothes, meticulously folded, stained, and moth-eaten. Journals with names, prayers, disturbing confessions. A few trinkets, crucifixes, faded photographs, and beneath them, fragments of human bone. Forensic analysis would later confirm the bones belonged to multiple women between the ages of 18 and 40. Some had dental work consistent with 1980s practices. But the most chilling fact of all? Not a single identity matched any missing persons report in national databases. The silencing when authorities were notified, they arrived quietly. No press. No tape. No national alerts. Samples were taken. The remains were bagged. Then, without explanation, the case was closed. No follow-up. No conclusions. No names. What had been discovered was not just forgotten, it was buried. That area of Idaho had once been home to a chain of isolated religious camps. Founded in the 1970s by a man known only as Father Abram, the camps promised spiritual salvation through obedience, silence, and complete submission to Scripture. Women, especially, were considered vessels for purity and punishment. Families desperate for moral correction sent their daughters there. Some of those daughters never came home. By 2003, the last camp was gone. Buildings destroyed. Records incinerated. Even satellite images showed only burnt clearings where once dozens of cabins stood. It was as if someone had systematically erased the entire network from history. But those crates in 2015 proved something remained. The doctrine's origins, Father Abram, was never legally identified, though survivors describe him as a former seminary dropout with extreme views on female sin. He believed women were born spiritually defective and needed purification through pain, isolation, and obedience. His doctrine combined distorted Christian fundamentalism with his own written commandments, which included the 7 trials, psychological and physical punishments women had to endure to be reborn. Some survivors recall being forced into long fasts, buried in shallow graves as a form of repentance, and made to wear blindfolds for weeks. Journals recovered from the crates detailed disturbing rituals, women being locked in rooms with verses carved into the walls, or forced to write the same prayers 10,000 times in blood drawn from their own bodies. And if they resisted, if they screamed, questioned, or begged to leave, they were labeled erased. No one ever explained what erased meant. Until the crates. The migration, the destruction of the camps in Idaho did not destroy the doctrine. Survivors and former insiders claim the ideology simply went underground. Some families still practicing it moved south and east, settling in the Appalachian Mountains, in remote valleys of Texas, and in off-grid communities in rural Canada. These newer compounds are far more secretive. No public names. No online presence. Outsiders are rarely seen. Inside, women are still subjected to cleansing. Some survivors say the doctrine has evolved into a full-blown cult with encrypted teachings, paramilitary training, and strict breeding programs. Children born into these communities are homeschooled, unregistered, and raised to never question the doctrine. Their mothers, many of whom were likely erased in the early camps, are now only known through myth and whispers. The investigation that never was law enforcement agencies, when contacted about the 2015 crate discovery, offer only vague denials. Local reporters who initially tried to follow the case found themselves stonewalled. One journalist received anonymous threats, then vanished after moving to write a full exposé. Her car was later found abandoned near the Canadian border. Her laptop, filled with notes on the doctrine of erasure, was missing. Documents obtained through whistleblowers suggest some officials may have known about the camps long before their destruction. Internal memos hinted at religious freedom boundaries and cultural sensitivity concerns. In other words, don't get involved. No one has ever been charged. No agency has issued an official statement. Those crates are now evidence in a locked facility somewhere in Washington, D.C., but their contents remain classified. The voices left behind from the journals pulled out of those crates, we hear their words. I am not unclean. I am not what he says I am. My name is Rebecca. Please remember my name. They made us wear white robes and walk into the forest barefoot. I don't remember how long I was alone. I just know when I woke up, she was gone. They said she'd been erased. We all know what happens when the bell rings 3 times. Each line is a whisper from the grave, a plea to be remembered, to not vanish in vain. The doctrine lives, the crates in the ravine were not an accident. They were a message. Whether left by someone trying to expose the truth, or as a final burial by those who believed, we may never know. What we do know is this: 278 women vanished, and no one looked for them. The camps are gone, but the doctrine lives on, hidden in the backwoods and behind closed doors, and somewhere out there, behind a gate no one can see, another daughter may be writing her name into a journal, hoping someone finds it before it's too late. Remember her. Speak her name. Do not let silence win. A story scrubbed from headlines, ignored by courts, and erased from every public record. A story about silence, not just the absence of sound, but the deliberate crushing of voices, of lives, of women who were taught that obedience meant invisibility. 278 women vanished from religious doctrine camps over 3 decades. Only 12 made it out alive, not whole, not free, but alive. They don't use their real names anymore. They live in different cities, under different identities, shadows trailing them like fog. Some can't remember who they were before the camps. Some still wake up screaming, trapped in memories they cannot explain. And some, even now, still receive handwritten notes, left on their doorsteps, sealed in ash, with one sentence etched in warped ink: "You were never meant to speak." But one of them did. The voice of Martha 9. She calls herself Martha 9. Not because that was her real name, but because it was the name the doctrine gave her, a number among many. In a recording leaked by a sympathetic therapist, her voice trembles, then steadies as she speaks. "We were meant to vanish. But silence only makes the roots grow deeper, and the world needs to know what was planted there." Martha 9 described camps where women were not allowed to speak unless spoken to, where mirrors were forbidden, where names were stripped and replaced with numbers, where every woman was made to confess to sins she never committed, under the belief that womanhood itself was a spiritual disease, the punishment for rebellion, isolation, starvation, and, eventually, erasure. A fate worse than death. To be erased wasn't just a metaphor. It was literal, clinical, complete. The women selected for erasure were led away in silence. No goodbyes. No screams. Just the soft sound of a hymn sung by those left behind. A chilling lullaby designed to dull the horror. Sometimes, days later, their belongings would be burned. Other times, their journals would be found with pages torn out, entries rewritten by different hands, made to look as though they had never existed at all. The ones who survived remember watching friends vanish overnight. One woman remembered finding blood in the chapel. Another recalled the screams in the forest, muffled, distant, then gone. But none of these stories were ever taken seriously. No police reports were filed. No public inquiries made. Because no one wanted to believe that doctrine-based genocide could happen in modern America. The survivors and their scars, the 12 women who escaped live fragmented lives. 1 has partial memory loss. She can't remember her name, her parents, or the year she entered the camp. Another hasn't left her apartment in 6 years. A third lives under witness protection, despite no official case ever being opened. Some still wear long sleeves even in summer, hiding the marks left by beatings, restraints, and ritual branding. Others hide the emotional scars, the terror of being touched, the inability to speak in front of men, the belief, instilled through years of psychological warfare, that they deserve the pain. 1 survivor kept a single object from her past, a torn photograph of a girl with a rope around her wrist, smiling. On the back, written in faded pencil, "I am not a vessel. I am a voice." The cover-up. No arrests. No press conferences. No classified files ever declassified. The doctrine camps operated in plain sight, protected by legal loopholes, shielded by religious freedom clauses, and aided by silence. Whispers suggest that local officials were bribed. Some even had relatives in the camps, daughters who were never seen again. A journalist who tried to investigate disappeared in 2016. Her last known message: "There's more than one camp still active." Her car was found a week later in Tennessee. She was never found. The government response: none. No task force. No hearings. Not even a footnote. The shadow still grows though the doctrine camps were dismantled. The ideology was not. It moved underground into remote Appalachian compounds, isolated Canadian communes, and backwoods Texas ranches with no power, no phone, no trail. Those places are off-grid, protected, armed, and the belief system that women are inherently broken, that obedience is divine, and that erasure is mercy continues to be passed down. To daughters. To wives. To the next generation of silent vessels. Some camps now use different names. They recruit through healing retreats, scriptural retreats, obedience missions. Always the same pattern. nophones.no, contact.no, return.278, women.vanish.no, trial.no, justice.no, names in public memory, only ashes, whispers, and 12 shattered survivors walking among us. Too afraid to speak, too haunted to forget, but we tell this story because silence is the oldest weapon ever forged. It doesn't break bones. It erases them. It doesn't leave scars. It convinces you that you deserve them. This story is not just about what happened. It's about what could happen again, because when we don't name monsters, they don't disappear. They grow. In darkness. In doctrine. In silence. So if you hear a name, Martha 9, Rebecca 2, Sister Ruth, remember that someone tried to wipe them from existence and failed because they lived. They survived, and they want you to know, never let the doctrine rise again, never let the silence win, and never forget the 278. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss out on more hidden historical story that could be waiting for you. Thanks for watching, and happy horrible stories hunting.